Hello, this is Kyle, also known as Alien Dude, reviewing today this tactical sword by the brand Fidestizen. Right up front, I did not buy this sword. It was sent to me for review by Fidestizen. If you're interested in buying one, there is a link in the description to their listing on Amazon, where this sells for $140, or if you went with the white grip, it would sell for $130. Both of those prices are as of this recording. They very well could change. And I don't believe that link tracks that I sent you or anything. I don't get any kind of kickback if you happen to buy one of these swords. So, like I said, tactical sword. This sword came disassembled and I had to assemble it. We'll get into that more during the hilt section, because that's the primary place where you would assemble the sword. And Fidestizen's listing on Amazon, the name of the sword is a word salad of sword terms, including claymore. This has nothing to do with a claymore. So I'm just going to refer to it as the Fidestizen tactical sword because that's a good description of it, I think. The sword does come with a scabbard here, and the fit is pretty good. It's not a lot of rattle in any dimension. A little bit of rattle, but not a lot. And if I hold it upside down, it slides right out. But it's not terribly loose, so it's a pretty decent fit. The scabbard itself is wood core, but then the outside feels like it's got some kind of plastic spray, or some kind of plastic coating on here. It feels very plasticky, but if I look inside, it looks like wood. Overall, it's a very simple scabbard. It does have a metal throat and shape, and it also has this cord on here that I really don't know what the point of. It looks like I could unravel it. It's not actually glued on here or anything, but then how would I use that? Presumably for some kind of suspension? I don't know. It's odd, doesn't really make much sense. What I tend to do, because this shiny surface attracts fingerprints very easily when I'm oiling swords. Oftentimes, if my hand gets a little oily, I go pick up the scabbard and then there's nasty looking fingerprints on there. So when I'm oiling this sword, I grab it by the scabbard by that cord, and that prevents the fingerprints from showing up anywhere near as much. All right, let's take a look at the hilt. This sword did come with all the hardware needed to assemble it, including some spare nuts and bolts here, and is relatively easy to put together. You'll see on screen here me disassembling it and reassembling it. I ended up cutting that footage a little bit because I didn't have a good place to reassemble it. It was a little tricky to get it on camera, so I just ended up getting down on the floor and assembling it on the floor. It worked a lot easier, and frankly, that's a good thing. That means that this sword is actually, you don't need a workbench to assemble it. So it is a sword that is not peened. You have to assemble and unassemble it. And when I am tightening the nut on the pommel, you can feel the threads don't feel particularly great. I have to crank on it and they kind of slip into place rather than giving a good locking feel. So I don't have a lot of confidence in those threads. And you can see from this still taken from when I was disassembling the sword, that looks like the thread is not part of the tang. It looks to me like it was probably welded on. So not the best construction method there. But I like the overall appearance of the hilt. Even though this is not at all my jam, I am not into the tactical looks, I think this does a good job of capturing that look and capturing that aesthetic and doing its own thing. I like this pommel. This is inspired by a fishtail pommel, I would say, and it's actually pretty well executed. There's absolutely no hot spots anywhere. It's chamfered over nicely. It acts as a good hand stop. My hands can't really slide past it if I'm cutting. And overall, I like it. The blackening on it seems to be quite durable and very even and looks nice too. The grip, I don't really have much good to say about it, except the fact that, again, I think it captures the look they were going for very, very well. But it's some kind of plastic-like material. I don't know if it is actually plastic. I'm not a materials guy. I don't know what it's actually made of. But it feels and looks very plasticky to me. And while I can get a good grip on the sword, if I really, grip it and try to rotate it, I have a very strong and effective grip on here, but it doesn't feel particularly good to grip. It's plastic or something similar. That's just not a particularly fun material to grip. But at the same time, it's probably pretty inexpensive, which this sword needs. This is very much a budget-oriented sword, and you always have to accept compromises in budget-oriented swords. So the fact that it's effective is probably the best thing I could possibly say about this style of grip. So I guess that is something good to say. I just really don't like the way it feels in the hand, even though it's effective. The crossguard on here is very clearly inspired by European medieval style crossguards. This is a very iconic shape, but it's a little bit thick and chunky for this style. It's quite thick here in the center. It does taper in towards the tips of the quillins, but it doesn't taper enough, and it's too thick to start as well. These quillin tips could be half the thickness, and they would be a better representation of this style of crossguard. And the thickness here in the center is problematic if I want to thumb the blade. The style of swordsmanship that I know a tiny, tiny, tiny bit about is Lichtenauer Germanic style fencing. And you thumb the blade for several different techniques in that, including some false edge cuts, for flug guards, for ox guards. You thumb the blade in those techniques, and it does not feel comfortable here. I can either extend my thumb out quite a bit to get it on there, but then these fingers do not have a good grip on the blade at all, on the sword at all. Or if I choke back a little bit, I can't really thumb it like this because the crossguard's too thick. So there's not really a good way for me to thumb this blade, which detracts from its ability to execute sword techniques that I'm familiar with. I will say all the corners are chamfered over very nicely. There's no hot spots here, although this can dig into the thumb if I have it in a spot. Like if I get close enough, like right there, I can thumb it kind of. I still don't have a good grip, and it's digging into this part right here is digging into my thumb a little bit. There's no way to really fix that other than just make the crossguard thinner. The finish on the crossguard is a black that looks to me like it's been powder coated on, just like the pommel. I like the look overall. It's very modern, but that's okay. This is a modern sword. If we look at the gap where it meets the blade, it is rectangular. No real effort was taken to make it match the shape of the blade, but that's okay at this price point. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So as you can see, this is a hefty sword at 3 pounds, 12 ounces. And a huge reason for that is that it features very little distal taper. It starts around 6.5 millimeters thick, tapers approximately 1 millimeter throughout the entire thing with a little bit of unevenness there. And then right at the tip, it actually does taper in down to 2 to 2.5 millimeters. So not a lot of distal taper. The profile taper is pretty even throughout and lends to a sword that kind of looks like a Type 12A blade with a fuller that runs most of the way up the blade. Although the cross section past the fuller is a diamond, which is not accurate for a 12A. This is not intended to be a historical replica, though. This is a modern sword, but that is a kind of, it's obviously inspired by historical swords, and to me, it looks like the blade is inspired by that 12A Great Sword of War style of blade. There's a blackened finish on here. I don't know what this finish is. When it came to me, it was very even. It has suffered a few scratches here and there from cutting, but the weird thing is that whenever I oil it, no matter how much I clean this blade, whenever I go to oil it, some brown gunk gets onto whatever I'm using to wipe the oil on. You can see that here. I don't know what that is, but the fact that I have cleaned this and cleaned this and cleaned this and it's still happening makes me think that this blackened, whatever it is that's doing that, whatever that coating is just slowly rubbing off, and it's not going to be particularly durable. Just a hunch here, but that's my thoughts on it. I do like the look of the blackening. It works for a tactical sword. I wouldn't really like this look for anything that's meant to evoke a true historical sword, but that's not this, so I do like it on here. The surfaces of the blade are pretty even. There's definitely some rippling here, nothing egregious. And the fuller is pretty straight, but it doesn't really end at the same point. You can see here, it's a little hard to see the marking because of that blackening, but you can see there's a good amount of difference where the fullers end on each side. At this price point, that's not really a problem. 140 bucks is a very low cost for a sword, so you're going to get a good amount of compromises. The beveling on the sword is nicely done with a smooth bevel from the edge of the fuller out to the actual edge, and there is a slight bit of apple seeding here. Not a lot. There's not a ton of niku, if you want to use that terminology. Here, there's not a lot of meat behind the edge, but there is a little bit there. It could use to be a bit more, in my opinion, especially for a tactical sword. You generally want those to be a little bit more robust. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but it's not terrible. It's not razor edge. It's not super thin. It just could use to be a little bit more apple seeded over, a little bit more meat behind the edge. But this sword doesn't need the extra weight there. So there's trade-offs there. The actual sharpness surprised me. It's actually quite nicely sharpened and does a very effective job at cutting targets. So let's talk about cutting. Backyard cutting, this sword does surprisingly well. I was not expecting a whole lot out of it, to be frank. It's a very budget sword. It is tactical. I had to assemble the hilt. There's a lot of things behind this that would make me think, that trigger my prejudices, that make me think it's not going to be particularly effective. This sword was very effective at cutting light targets in the backyard, such as different types of water bottles. The heavier water bottles, the thicker plastic, it definitely struggled on those. A lot of those, you'll see them kind of fly off to the side, but it actually did cut into them. It just wasn't able to get all the way through. Part of that is because it is beefy, it is thick. So the rigidity helps it power it into the cut and start that cut. But because it's still pretty thick, more energy transfers into the target and sends it flying rather than sending the sword through a clean cut. So if this sword were thinner, it would be able to slice through the targets better rather than starting a cut and then flinging the target off to the side. That's what happened quite a bit with the thicker targets that I cut on here. Now, I also, because this is a tactical sword, I took it to some wood branches on a tree that I am trying to trim back some. I don't normally do this with swords, but I figure a tactical, post-apocalyptic survival sword needs to be able to be a multiple purpose tool. This is not just a sword, right? It's going to be a survival tool. So in a survival situation, you're going to need to hack into wood from time to time. So I did that. It works. It cuts into the targets, into the wood fine. The edge didn't really take any noticeable damage. There's some very slight glinting in a few places, but just a little bit of stropping is going to clean that up very well. So it definitely can chop into wood effectively. That being said, it didn't really feel good to chop into wood. More on that in a second. I also took it to a stump in my yard, put the tip into it and really bent into the sword some to put some force into it and make it bend. Now this is a very rigid sword because of how thick it is. So it doesn't bend very much, but I put a decent amount in. I got it to bend. I looked down the length of it. It returned to perfectly straight with no issues at all. So it seems like between that and the edge basically taking no real noticeable damage from impacting the wood, it seems like the heat treatment on here is pretty decent. let's move on to how this sword handles. The first thing I want to talk about is the weight. This is 3 pounds, 12 ounces, which is quite, not high, but on the high end for a sword of these dimensions. It's not a particularly long blade. It doesn't have a particularly long hilt. So it's hefty, and that is because there's not a lot of distal taper here, and you feel that when moving this around. This is not a quick sword. I would imagine you would feel this if you were carrying it in your post-apocalyptic tactical survival kit, which I kind of assume that that's kind of what this sword is going for, giving the all blacked out look, the easy assembly and disassembly, and just the whole theme of tactical survival type thing. And it's got a lot of weight to the blade, not so much that you can't move it around. You saw during the cutting, I was able to get some pretty good cuts. That's a testament to the edge, and the rigidity helps with that too. And this is quite a rigid sword. There's very little flex to it. And that's, again, because there's not really much distal taper at all, which keeps it from truly handling like a nimble sword, or like a sword really should handle. Now, I talked about this a little bit during the cutting section where I was talking about the hand shock that this sword does when impacting harder targets. That's because the hilt node is not in a good place. It's got very little flex to it, like I said. The blade node is right around here. It seems like a pretty decent spot. But the hilt node is more up into the crossguard, even into the base of the blade. When I just do this, I feel those vibrations in my hand much more than I would like to do. And that's why when impacting a hard target, I get more those vibrations traveling through my arms and making things feel unpleasant. What I really noticed is actually on my left hand. And if you think about it, the further up the blade the hilt node is, the more vibrations there's going to be down here in the second part. And that's where most of the unpleasant shock was in my offhand and traveling up into my elbow. So the sword doesn't really handle like a sword. What does it handle like? It handles like what a person who doesn't know swords thinks a sword handles like. And that's, again, because of the lack of distal taper. It feels even weight throughout pretty much the whole blade. A lot of the weight is out here, which is not where you want it. On a sword, generally speaking, a well-balanced sword, most of the weight is going to be in the hilt, and that's to offset the lesser weight out here because of the way levers work. If we look at the point of balance, it's not that far out. That looks like about 4.5 inches, somewhere around there. But that means that because there is a lot of weight out here, there has to be more weight back here. And this is a chunky pommel. That's adding quite a bit of weight. So that's how it gets to be still relatively balanced in a decent spot. But that means the overall weight is high. 3 pounds, 12 ounces, a little bit high for this type of sword. I already mentioned that. So again, it doesn't really handle the way a sword is supposed to handle. And what it actually reminds me of quite a bit is the Sword of Rovin I just reviewed 2 weeks ago. It handles a little dumb. It doesn't do me any favors in moving it around. I don't feel like if I want to start a cut and then redirect it, it does not want to do that. It wants to continue in that one motion. It doesn't want to stop I don't want to cut and stop it. It does not feel good doing that. It wants to cut and keep moving. It wants to pull you through the cuts, frankly. And it just doesn't do the things that a sword really should do if you want a traditional sword. Now, is this a traditional sword? No, it's a tactical sword. It's a modern sword. It's got a plastic type hilt, for God's sake. So obviously it's not intending to replicate historical swords, but that's a shame because you don't have to replicate the looks or the thought process behind historical swords, but you really should want to replicate the handling, because handling, they knew how swords should handle. Their lives depended on it. Our lives, and except in maybe some incredibly rare circumstances, will never depend on the sword. They knew how swords should handle, and therefore we should take inspiration from that, in my view. And there is no better way to exemplify the difference than to compare it to this APOC survival longsword designed by Gus Trim. This sword looks nothing like historical European longswords, kind of like Gian in some ways, but not like a European longsword, but it handles like a European longsword to a degree, not completely. Watch my review for more details. But it certainly understands distal taper, reducing the weight out here, adding it back in the hilt so that the sword moves around quick and can be redirected and cuts can continue through and all that stuff. All the things that swords want to do, that they should do, this sword does. This sword takes those historical handling properties and transmits them onto a sword that looks nothing at all like them, that is very clearly a modern design for modern aesthetics, and frankly, not just modern aesthetics, very much that tactical survival aesthetic. And this does it much, much better than the Fidestisan sword does. But I will say, one thing that this sword definitely does better, more effectively than the APOC, is chop into wood. This sword bit much deeper and much more effectively into the branches than the APOC did when I tested it. Now, this sword also bit my hands quite a bit and my arms, but the APOC did some of that as well. This sword definitely was better at being a wood chopper. That makes sense because it is much more rigid. And when you're chopping into a branch, rigidity helps deliver that energy into the branch much better than a blade that can flex. And therefore, this is probably better for that. But frankly, you know what's even better would be an axe. So what are some areas that could be improved on this sword? Well, I have to acknowledge the price. At $140, $130 for the other grip, there's not a lot of room for changes. There's not a lot of room for improvements. $140 is already scraping the bottom of what you could really expect to get a functional sword for. So I'm not really going to talk about things that would cost more. What I would say is a little bit of a redesign, especially in the blade. I think taking inspiration from a Type 12A sword, which to me is what this does, I think that's a mistake. I think taking inspiration from a later medieval sword would work better. Something like a Type 16A or an 18A, something like that, something that is more rigid by default than the earlier medieval swords. Then you could have something with more profile taper. The thickness is not going to be as big of a deal. You don't need to do as much distal taper on later medieval swords because the profile taper does a lot of the weight reduction. Now, you still need some. That's a whole other thing to get into. But regardless, I think if you take inspiration from later medieval swords with the more profile taper, you can still get that really rigid blade that it seems like I think they want, whilst not completely getting rid of the ability to cut. And with that rigid blade and it's going to be a pretty narrow tip, you're going to be able to use the sword more as a pry bar in an apocalyptic setting, which might be appropriate for what you want to do. So that's the primary thing I think that could be improved on this, is a different blade type. I think also slimming down the crossguard could use, that could really use to be done, especially if you want to enable thumbing the blade. So bottom line, this sword sells for $140. Is it worth that price? Well, for me, no. This is not really my cup of tea. I don't really connect with this styling. I can appreciate it, but it's not for me. But for people who do like that, who want this kind of sword, I'd say yes, the sword is worth it, but. And the but there is a big one. And that is the fact that the APOC Tactical Survival Longsword is roughly similar in price, and I think a better sword overall. That's not to say this is bad. This is heavy and a little bit clunky in the hands, but it is an effective cutter, and it's better at chopping wood, although the hand shocks are not good. And the APOC longsword is not really good at cutting wood. So it's a trade-off. What I will say is this sword has more room for customization, especially in the blade. If you want to not worry about this blackening and grind in more distal taper, you could make this a better sword. You would have a hard time doing that with the APOC because it's already got a lot of distal taper. And this brings me to something I wanted to talk about in the Sword of Rovin I reviewed 2 weeks ago. That sword did not have that space for customization of the blade. It started too thin, and therefore you couldn't really grind in distal taper without turning the sword into a floppy noodle. This sword, because it starts at around 6.5 millimeters thick, has room for you to grind in more distal taper and improve the handling. Now that's not at all something I'm going to be the person to do. I don't have those skills. But if that's something that you want to do, if you want to take this sword, grind in distal taper, fabricate a new hilt, maybe even fabricate new hilt components, or maybe thin them out, that kind of thing. This is a good base for a project, I think. And at $140, it's pretty inexpensive too. And that's going to wrap up this review. A huge thank you to Fidestizin for sending me this sword to review, and thank you to everybody who is watching. If you haven't, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, all that stuff. Until next time, Alien Toot out.